My name is Salvi Larson and I'm 26 years old. The dinner happened on a Tuesday in October, 6 days before I was supposed to sign my lease. Outside the window of my parents' house in Harrow Point, the rain came down in long, steady sheets against the glass, the kind of rain that starts before dawn and doesn't decide anything by evening. The fir trees at the back of the property had gone dark with it. The neighbor's dock light made a pale smear on the standing water in the yard. I had driven up from my temporary apartment, a sublet I'd been in for 4 months while I waited for the new place to be ready, through 40 minutes of that rain, wipers working the whole way, the highway north of Bellport running black and slick under the headlights. I arrived at 6:19 p.m. to find the table already set and my father standing at the head of it with the expression he wore when he had decided something. I had left the Kessler offices at 4:30 that afternoon. Annika Strand had caught me near the elevator and asked if everything was all right. She had noticed I was leaving earlier than usual, which was accurate, since I typically stayed until 5:30 or 6. I had told her I had a family dinner in Harrow Point. She had said to drive safe and mean it, the way she said most things. I had said I would. I had driven north through the Freight District and picked up the highway at the Bellport on-ramp. The highway runs along the Sound for the first 15 miles north of Bellport, and I had driven it enough times to know the way the water changes color in the late afternoon in different weather. Tonight it had been flat and dark and silver gray, barely distinguishable from the clouds above it, the buoys marking the ferry lane the only contrast. The ferry itself had passed going south as I drove north, its running lights amber and red against the gray, moving on a schedule I knew from a lifetime of watching it. I had thought on the drive about what I was going to do with the envelope. I had thought about it in the methodical way I thought about problems at work, tracing the decision tree from each possible event. If he shows the form, if he doesn't show the form, if there is a form but it's different from what I expect, if there is no form and I have misread the situation entirely. I had run each branch and found that in every case the envelope was the right thing to have. What changed was only how soon and whether. I knew that expression. I had been reading it my whole life. It was not angry. It was settled. It was the expression of a man who has already run the numbers in his head and found them satisfactory, and is now waiting for the room to catch up to him. The envelope was in my bag. A standard credit union envelope, ivory unsealed, with my name printed in the return address corner and the Harrow Point Community Credit Union logo in blue ink. I had put it there 4 days ago when the document arrived in the mail. I had not mentioned it to anyone. My mother was in the kitchen. I could hear her moving, the particular sound of cabinet doors opened and closed with just slightly too much care. She had made the casserole she made when she was managing something, the one with the potatoes and the cream that took 90 minutes and required her to stay near the oven. I had eaten it at difficult dinners for as long as I could remember. The last time had been 2 winters before, when Eric came home from Bellport without warning and my parents had rearranged the living room and my mother had made the casserole and no one had talked directly about what had happened. The house smelled of that casserole and of the wet wool of my father's work jacket, which was draped over the chair nearest the door the way it always was when he'd come in from the yard. The entryway light was 1 bulb short and had been for 2 years. I had replaced it once. It had gone out again and stayed out. I stood in the dim entryway for a moment, adjusting to the temperature and the smell and the particular quality of the quiet, which was not restful. I set my bag down by the entryway bench. I took off my wet jacket and hung it on the hook beside my father's. The house was the same temperature it had always been, not quite warm enough in the corners and too warm near the oven. I had grown up in that temperature. I knew it the way you know something you've never had to think about, until the day you start to think about leaving it. My brother Eric was already seated. He was 29 and he had moved back home 2 years earlier after a job in Bellport hadn't worked out, and he had been there since, in his old room, in the comfortable groove of a life my parents had arranged around him without anyone formally deciding that was what they were doing. He was on his phone when I came in. He glanced up when I set my keys on the counter. He said, "Hey." I said, "Hey." I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down and poured myself a glass of water from the pitcher on the table. He set his phone face down. Not because I'd arrived, I thought. Because he already knew what was coming tonight and had run out of the kind of distraction a phone could provide. My Aunt Petra was there too. She was my father's younger sister and she lived 20 minutes south in a house she had inherited from their mother, and she came to family dinners sometimes the way harbor weather comes, not invited exactly, just arriving before you've finished deciding whether to expect it. She had a glass of water in front of her and her hands flat on the table, and she did not look comfortable. She looked like a woman who had been told something in advance and was now waiting to see whether it would happen the way she'd been told it would. She looked at me when I came in. She gave me a small, neutral nod. I nodded back. I had not spoken to Petra in advance. I did not know what she had been told or by whom. I noted her expression and set it aside. My father came in from the back of the house. He had been in the yard. His boots left wet prints on the kitchen floor, and he left them on the mat by the back door and came to the table in his socks, which was a small thing I had noted my whole life as the one domestic concession he made without being reminded. He sat at the head of the table and looked at the centerpiece my mother had put there, a small gourd arrangement she'd made from the patch at the back of the property every October since I could remember. And he looked at the table settings and he looked at me, and he had that expression. He said, "Good, you made it through the rain." I said, "It wasn't bad until the Bellport exit." He said, "Highway was running slow." I checked. He said this as he shook out his napkin, informational, occupying space, the scaffolding around the point. My mother brought the casserole dish to the table. She set it down and did not look at my father and sat in her chair and began serving in the careful, purposeful way she moved through rooms she didn't want to be in. She served Eric first, then me, then Petra, then my father. She served herself last and in the smallest portion, which was something I had noticed for the first time at 11 and had not stopped noticing since. For a few minutes no one said anything. The casserole was good the way it always was, the cream thickened correctly, the potatoes soft without being dissolved, the kind of dish that required attention and repaid it. The rain moved against the kitchen window. Eric set his phone face down. My father ate with the measured efficiency of a man who considers meals a functional event. Petra cut her food into small pieces and chewed them carefully and did not speak. I had eaten this meal at this table more times than I could count. I knew the particular weight of the air in this room before a difficult conversation the way I knew the harbor fog, by texture, not just sight. I knew it was coming. I had come here knowing it was coming. I had prepared for it over 6 weeks, and I had sat in my sublet apartment the previous night and reviewed the preparation one last time, the way I reviewed proposals before presenting them, and I had decided I was ready, and I was. I had not told my father I was coming today with the envelope in my bag. I had not told anyone. That was not deceptive exactly. I had simply not announced a decision I had made in private, and had waited to see what the evening would produce before deciding how much of it to use. The preparation had taken most of 6 weeks. Not the credit union visit that had taken an afternoon, but the layers around it, the things I had needed to make certain of before I walked into this room. I had verified on 3 separate occasions that my employer's payroll system had no link to my father's name or contact information. I had confirmed that my lease application had been processed and approved under my name alone, with no references solicited from my family. I had made sure that the operations manager role was signed and official and could not be undone by a phone call to Annika Strand from someone claiming to have useful information about my reliability. I had done all of this in the same methodical way I had learned to do everything that mattered, without announcing it, without asking for approval, without allowing it to become a conversation before it was a fact. My mother had called me on a Sunday 3 weeks earlier, during the kind of call that was nominally about nothing. How was the sublet? Had I decided on movers? Was I planning to come for dinner before the move? Halfway through she had said, in a quieter register, that my father had been asking about my account balance. He had asked her what she knew about the move plans and whether she thought I had enough saved. She had told me this carefully, in the way she sometimes shared information she knew she should share but was uncertain how it would land. I had said I understood and changed the subject and called the credit union the next morning to confirm that the removal had processed correctly. The Sunday call had told me what I needed to know. The form I had seen briefly on the table beside my father's plate when I walked in tonight, tucked into the folder but visible at the edge, confirmed the rest. He had prepared something. He had organized an occasion. He had arranged for Eric to be there and for Petra to be there, and he had made sure my mother had time to make the casserole. This was a prepared evening. I had arrived at a prepared evening knowing what I was bringing to it, which gave me the particular composure of someone who has already decided. I watched my father eat. He was a large man, well-built, with the quality of someone who understood systems and liked to run them. He had worked in marine salvage coordination for 20 years and then moved into logistics management, and the form on the table beside his plate was an expression of that quality as much as anything else. He wanted to see where the money was. He wanted it in a place he could account for. He believed, I thought, that this was protecting me. He was not entirely wrong that it was also protecting something else. I watched Petra refill her water glass from the pitcher. She did it without offering to fill anyone else's. She attended to her own needs with quiet efficiency and didn't make a project of it. I had been watching her do this my entire life, and I had decided, sometime in my early 20s, that it was something worth learning. You do not have to announce yourself. You do not have to ask. You simply take care of what needs to be taken care of, and you do not require the room to witness it. I had been practicing that principle for 4 years. The form on the table was, among other things, a test of how well I had learned it. My mother refilled the water glasses without being asked. It was the kind of small attentive act that existed somewhere between genuine care and 25 years of habit, the kind of thing you do until you no longer know which it is. She sat back down and looked at the casserole dish and did not look at me. Her face had the careful, fixed quality it got when she was managing multiple things at once and had decided that looking at the thing she was managing was going to make it harder to manage it. I had known my mother a long time. I had learned to read her silences the way you learn any language that isn't your first, imperfectly, through exposure, by making mistakes and adjusting. Her silence tonight was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of someone who was present and uncomfortable and had decided that the most honest thing she could contribute was to not make it worse. That was its own kind of courage, and I recognized it. The good dishes were out. My mother used the good dishes for occasions that required them, and the category was not festive, it was consequential. The good dishes meant something was going to happen, and she wanted to be surrounded by things that felt stable. I had eaten off those dishes at my grandfather's funeral dinner, at the dinner before Eric left for Belport, and at several other dinners I had classified over the years under the general heading of formal difficulty. The casserole was half gone. My father's plate was clean. He had eaten with the same focused efficiency he brought to most tasks, not quickly, not slowly, but at the pace of a man who had decided in advance how long each thing would take and was proceeding accordingly. He would begin the conversation when the plates were cleared. That was the pattern. He never started difficult conversations over food. He waited until the eating was done and the table existed as a neutral surface rather than a meal. Eric tried to fill the silence once, halfway through the meal, with something about the wet October. My father agreed that it had been a wet October. A few more sentences. Then the silence settled back. I had spent some portion of the drive up thinking about Eric. Not with resentment exactly. With the clear-eyed acceptance of someone who had stopped expecting a particular thing and had moved on to simply noting when it was absent. He had known the general direction of what I was doing for 2 years, and he had said nothing to support it and nothing to undermine it. He had existed in his room and let the current of the house carry him. What I hadn't fully known until tonight was that he had been briefed on this dinner. It was visible in the way he had looked at me when I came in the particular quality of his silence. He was sitting in the position of someone who has been told where to stand and has stood there. The rain picked up briefly against the window. A gust ran along the glass and passed. The harbor road beyond the fir trees would be running fast now, the drainage ditches full, the curves dark and wet. I had driven that road all my life. I would drive it south tonight, and then in 6 days toward the apartment on Clearwater Street, and at some point the number of times I drove it toward this house would stop increasing and hold at whatever number it had reached. My father set his fork down. He straightened the napkin in his lap and set his water glass an inch to the right of where it had been, a small repositioning with no practical purpose, the kind of unconscious adjustment people make when they are preparing to speak and need their hands to do something first. He looked at the table once, the way he did when he was checking that everything was in order before he began. I had watched him do this at the head of every difficult conversation I could remember. The small preparatory gesture, the pause, the collecting of himself into the version that was going to make his case. He had a way of pausing before he began something important, a brief stillness, like a man checking his footing before he stepped forward. I had inherited that pause, though I used it differently. He said, "I'm glad you came. We need to talk about the move." I said, "All right." He said, "Your mother and I have been thinking about the account." I said, "Which account?" He said it the way he said practical things, the way he discussed gutters or tire rotations. He said I wouldn't survive out there on my own. Not yet. He said they thought I should let them hold my savings for me. For safekeeping. He said it like it was a reasonable thing, a generous thing, a thing a father who was paying attention would naturally offer. My brother Eric turned his phone face down on the table. Aunt Petra looked at the tablecloth. My father reached into the folder beside his plate and slid a form across to me. It moved smoothly on the tablecloth. He had done this before, this sliding of papers in this room, and he was good at it. I looked at the form once. It was a joint account authorization, pre-filled in his handwriting at the top. His name. The account number I had opened at 17. A signature line below, waiting. I set it down. I said nothing. Part 2. My full name is Solveig Ingrid Larsson, and I had been a credit union member since I was 17 years old, when I opened my first account with $200 from a summer job cleaning vacation rentals on the Harrow Point waterfront. I scrubbed bathrooms and stripped beds and carried linens down 3 flights of stairs in July heat for $11 an hour, and I deposited every paycheck in full, and I did not touch it. That was the beginning of what I had. Everything since had been the same principle applied to larger numbers over more years. I did not come from a family that talked about money clearly. I came from a family that talked around it, that used money the way some families use silence, as a form of control that could always be described, if you named it directly, as something else. As help. As concern. As just trying to make sure you're okay. My father, Gunnar Larsson, had worked as a marine equipment supply broker for 21 years. He sold navigational and deck hardware to commercial fishing operations and ferry contractors along the island routes between Harrow Point and the Straits to the north. He was good at it. He understood contracts and margins and the slow, patient accumulation of leverage, and he had a network of clients who respected him and called him Gun and did not look too carefully at the terms once the handshake was done. He was not a wealthy man. He was a man who understood very precisely where money was and what direction it was moving. He had always understood where my money was. My mother, Ragna, had worked part-time as a school office administrator for the past 12 years. She was organized and warm, and she deferred to my father in the specific way of a woman who had decided, a long time ago, that managing the distance between what he wanted and what was possible was her primary job. She was good at that job. She was not happy doing it. I did not think she had ever named that to herself clearly. I had taken my first real job at 22, after finishing my associate's degree in business administration at the community college in Harrow Point. I was hired as an accounts coordinator at Kessler Maritime Freight, a mid-size freight brokerage with offices on the Harbor Road in Harrow Point and a satellite operation in Bellport. I processed invoices, managed vendor payment schedules, reconciled accounts receivable, and over time absorbed the cash flow reporting that the previous coordinator had handled so imprecisely that the operations manager had stopped trusting the monthly numbers. I made the numbers accurate. I made them accurate consistently, which was a different and harder thing. I had been at Kessler for 4 years. I was the senior accounts coordinator. My salary was $54,000. My supervisor, a logistics manager named Donna who had been in freight for 19 years and who did not give compliments as a management strategy, had told me 3 months before the dinner that she was recommending me for a lead financial analyst position when a role opened in the Bellport office. She said she expected it within 6 months. She said it once and did not repeat it, which was how I knew she meant it. I had not told my father about the promotion track. I had learned not to tell him things that he would use as evidence that I didn't need what I had. What I had was $23,400 in savings at Harrow Point Community Credit Union, built over 4 years in deposits of $200 to $500 at a time, routed automatically from my paycheck before I could spend it on anything else. I also had $4,800 in a second account at a bank in Bellport that I had opened 8 months earlier when I started planning the move in earnest. The Bellport account was where I had been holding the lease deposit and the moving costs. It was in my name only. My father had no knowledge of it. I had chosen the Bellport branch specifically because it had no connection to any account I had held since I was 17. The credit union account was different. My father had been a secondary holder on it since I was a minor, added because the credit union required an adult cosigner for accounts opened by applicants under 18. I had never removed him. I had told myself for years that it didn't matter, that he would never actually do anything with that access, that the trust between a father and a daughter was worth more than the paperwork required to revoke it. I had started the removal process 6 weeks before the dinner. The apartment I was moving into was a one-bedroom on the third floor of a building on Clearwater Street in Bellport, 4 blocks from the freight office. Tall windows facing west. A radiator that knocked in the mornings. A small kitchen with a gas stove, which I had specifically asked about because I had been cooking on electric since I was 22 and I wanted the real thing. The building manager's name was Carol, and she had held the unit for me with a soft deposit of $500 while I arranged the finances, and she had sent me the lease to review 2 weeks earlier, and I had read every page of it twice. The lease start date was November 1st. That was 6 days away. The joint authorization form was on the table between my father and me. His name was at the top in his careful, deliberate handwriting. There was a notary block at the bottom unfilled. I looked at it once. My stomach dropped. Not from surprise. From the specific recognition of a thing you have anticipated and prepared for and still do not enjoy seeing arrive. I said nothing. The money I had saved had not been easy to save. The effort was specific, month by month, and it had happened alongside a different kind of work that no one at the table that evening had counted, and that I had never presented as evidence of anything, because I had not wanted to make a case for myself inside my own family. But the work was real and it was done, and I knew its exact shape. 4 years before the dinner, my father's accountant had a medical emergency 2 weeks before the tax deadline. My father's records were in a cardboard box in the garage, receipts, fuel logs, vendor invoices, none of it organized past 2014. I spent 11 evenings at the kitchen table, after my own workday, reconstructing 4 years of business expenses from bank statements and paper receipts that had gotten soft from garage damp. I filed on time. The refund was $3,200. My father told his colleagues he had gotten his paperwork together at the last minute and it had worked out fine. He did not mention me to them. He did not mention it to me either after. 3 years and 9 months before the dinner, Eric had called me at 9:23 p.m. on a Wednesday from Bellport. His landlord was threatening to withhold his full security deposit of $1,650 for damages Eric said weren't his. I spent 3 evenings reading Washington state landlord-tenant law, reviewing the move-in checklist Eric had signed, and writing a formal dispute letter that cited 2 specific RCW provisions. Eric sent it verbatim. The landlord returned the full deposit within 10 days. Eric sent me a thumbs-up emoji and did not mention it again. 3 years and 2 months before the dinner, my mother's car needed a repair. The shop quoted at $1,100. She mentioned it on the phone in a tone that was not quite asking. I had $1,400 in savings at that point. I transferred $900 to her account that afternoon, which covered the repair and left her $200 for the deductible. I rebuilt what I'd transferred over the following 4 months by cutting my grocery budget to $40 a week and not replacing my work shoes until the sole on the left one separated past the toe. My mother thanked me. She said I didn't have to. She did not tell my father where the money had come from. 6 weeks later, my father mentioned offhandedly that the car situation had sorted itself out. That these things always did. 2 years and 11 months before the dinner, my father had an invoice dispute with a hardware supplier in Anacortes who had billed him for a full delivery he said was short by $800 in product. He called me because I worked in freight. I spent a Saturday morning going through his purchase order against the delivery receipt and the supplier's packing list and found a unit count discrepancy introduced at the packing stage, the kind that the supplier's own warehouse records would have to confirm or deny. I wrote him a 1-paragraph summary with the specific line items marked. He took it to the supplier meeting. They credited him $740 and called it resolved. My father told me the guy had folded. He said he'd known he was right. 2 years and 4 months before the dinner, Eric moved back home after losing his job. My parents' household costs went up. My mother mentioned during a Sunday call that they were thinking of reducing their internet package because the bill had increased and things were stretched. I added $150 to my monthly contribution to the household without being asked. I had been sending $200 a month informally since I started at Kessler, an arrangement my father had proposed in the first week of my employment as something temporary that had never had an end date discussed. The additional $150 brought my total to $350 a month. I sent that amount for 7 months. When Eric found part-time work at the Marina Supply Shop, I brought it back to $200. 2 years and 1 month before the dinner, my father asked me to look over a service contract he was about to sign with a new ferry operation client. He said his lawyer was expensive and it was probably standard language and could I just check it. I read the full contract. Section 7 contained a liability clause that would have held my father personally responsible for equipment damage during transit under conditions that were not his fault and that the industry standard terms he believed he was signing would have excluded. I flagged it in a written note and suggested specific replacement language. His lawyer reviewed my note, confirmed the issue, and renegotiated the clause before signing. My father told me the lawyer had caught something in the contract. He said it had been worth the fee. 19 months before the dinner, my mother had a denied insurance claim for a preventive procedure that should have been fully covered under her plan. She had been going back and forth with the insurer for 6 weeks and was tired of it. I asked her to send me the explanation of benefits and her plan documents. I found the relevant coverage provision, cross-referenced it with the denial reason code, and wrote a 3-paragraph appeal letter that cited the plan document by section and subsection. She submitted it. The claim was approved on reconsideration 2 weeks later. The amount was $340. My mother said it felt like a miracle. I told her it was just the paperwork. 16 months before the dinner, my mother wanted to take her visiting sister to dinner at a restaurant on the water that she'd been told was worth trying. She was worried about the price. I found the restaurant's weekday fixed price menu, which ran $28 per person instead of the a la carte pricing she'd seen, made a reservation for 3 on a Tuesday, and sent her the confirmation. The evening cost $84. She sent me a photograph of the view from their table at dusk, the sound going silver in the low light, and she said it had been a perfect evening. 13 months before the dinner, my father's work van had a lapsed registration and a late renewal fee of $180 on top of the standard cost. He mentioned it to Eric in a conversation I was present for, and Eric said that was rough and my father said he'd figure it out. That night I transferred $180 to my father's account. He did not acknowledge receiving it. 3 weeks later he mentioned, to no one in particular, that the van was sorted. 10 months before the dinner I found a billing error in my parents' internet account while I was helping my mother compare rates for a cheaper plan. They had been charged a monthly equipment rental fee for 14 consecutive months on a modem they owned outright. I called the provider and was on hold for 41 minutes and documented the error and cited the account history, and the provider credited $196 back to the account and corrected the billing going forward. My mother said she never would have noticed. She asked how I'd known to look. 7 months before the dinner, Aunt Petra called me at 7:48 a.m. on a Saturday. Her water heater had failed overnight and a contractor was coming that morning and she wasn't sure the quote was fair. I looked up licensed plumbers in her county, found the average installed cost for the unit she described, and told her the number she'd been given was $340 above midpoint, but not outside the legitimate range if the contractor was established. I told her to ask about the permit and the warranty. She called me back at 11:15 a.m. to say she'd asked both questions, the contractor had answered both well, and she'd felt steady signing. She said she didn't know what she would do without me. I told her she would have figured it out. She said, maybe. But I didn't have to. My father did not know she had called me. 6 weeks before the dinner I submitted the form to remove my father's name from the credit union account. The credit union required a signed request, a processing period of 4 to 6 weeks, and a final confirmation appointment. I had submitted the form on a Monday afternoon. The account representative, a man named Marcus, had date-stamped it and told me the processing window, and I had scheduled my confirmation appointment for the Thursday after the lease signing. The removal was not yet complete. But the process, as of that Monday, was past the point where it could be quietly undone. In the 6 weeks since, I had sat at this table 4 times. I had eaten the casserole and listened to my father talk about his client pipeline and watched Eric watch television in the next room and said nothing about the account or the removal or the second account in Bellport or the apartment on Clearwater Street. I had told my mother the address on a Sunday phone call and asked her to wait. She had said she would try. I had understood that try had a specific meaning in this house and planned accordingly. The form was on the table. The rain moved against the glass. My father watched me with that settled expression, the one that had always meant the numbers were already in his favor. I looked at his name at the top of the form. I thought about Marcus at the credit union and the date stamp and the Thursday appointment and the $4,800 in Bellport that had never been on any form my father had ever seen. I let the silence hold. My father picked up the form and set it back down in front of me, closer this time, The way you move something towards someone who hasn't understood that it's meant for them. He said, we're not asking you to give it to us. We're asking to hold it. There's a difference. I said, all right. He said, you're 26. You've never lived on your own. Not really. The sublet doesn't count, that was always temporary. I said, I know what the sublet was. He said, then you know that what's coming is different. First month, last month, deposit. Utilities in your name. If something breaks, that's your cost. If you lose a shift, that's your margin. He said it patiently, the way he explained things to clients who were new to contracts. Your mother and I have been talking, and we think the responsible thing, the thing a person does when they're actually ready to be on their own, is to have a cushion they can access quickly. Not spend. Just have nearby. I said, I have a cushion. He said, in an account you can drain in a weekend if you panic. I said, I won't panic. He said, you don't know that yet. You haven't been in the situation yet. I said nothing. He leaned back slightly. He said, this isn't about trust. I want you to understand that. This is about structure. You're not someone who has managed a full household before. The utilities, the renter's insurance, the groceries when you're tired and you spend more than you planned, the unexpected repair, these things add up faster than you think when you're doing it completely alone. I said, I've been tracking a household budget for 4 years. He said, tracking someone else's. That's a different thing from running your own. I kept my voice even. My mother was looking at her plate. She had served herself a portion of the casserole and had not touched it. The steam had stopped rising from it. The room was warm and the windows had gone fully dark and the rain kept its steady pressure against the glass. Eric was watching me with the mild, patient expression of someone who has been briefed on the expected outcome and is waiting to see whether it arrives on schedule. My father said, we're not talking about all of it. Just the majority. You keep enough to cover 2 months of expenses in your own hands. We hold the rest in a joint account where both of us have to agree before anything moves. That's a safeguard. That's not a restriction. I said, a joint account requiring 2 signatures to withdraw is a restriction. That's the definition of what it is. He said, Salvii. I said, I'm not being difficult. I'm being accurate. He said, you're being defensive. And I understand that. You've worked hard for this money and you don't want anyone touching it. I get that. But I'm not anyone. I'm your father. I said, I know who you are. He said, then hear me as your father and not as a transaction. He looked at me steadily. You've always been the one who does things alone. I've watched you do that your whole life. And I respect it, I do genuinely, but there's a version of independence that's really just pride wearing practical clothes. And pride is expensive when you're 26 and the rent is due and something has gone sideways. I said, I've never missed a payment. He said, you've never had your name on a lease. I said, I will in 6 days. He said, exactly. 6 days. And between now and then we have one chance to put something in place so that when you walk into that building on your own, you're walking in with actual structure behind you and not just confidence. He set his hands flat on the table. That's all this is. That's the whole conversation. I said, who suggested the form? He said, your mother and I talked about it together. I said, whose idea was it to fill it out before I arrived? He said, that's not a useful question. I said, I think it is. He said, Salvii, I'm trying to have a practical conversation about your future and you're looking for a villain. There isn't one. There's just a father who knows how bank accounts work and a daughter who hasn't lived through a hard month alone yet. I said, I've had hard months. He said, here. In this house with this family around you. That's different. I said, the months I sent money home weren't easy. He paused. Something crossed his face, brief and unreadable, and then it was gone. He said, we've always appreciated that. I said, I know. He said, and that's exactly why I know you can manage. I'm not saying you can't manage. I'm saying that the first year alone is harder than the math suggests, and I want this structure in place so that if the math stops working for 1 month, you don't lose 4 years of work. I said, my savings won't disappear in 1 bad month. He said, not if we have this in place. I said, they won't disappear either way. He said, you can't know that. I said, I have an emergency fund built into the account. He said, inside the same account. I said, yes. He said, so if the primary account is drawn down, the emergency fund goes with it. I said, the account won't be drawn down. He said, but if it were? Walk me through what happens. If something unexpected came up, a medical cost, a car repair, a gap in your hours, and the account dropped below what you needed, what's your next step? I said, I'd manage it. He said, how specifically? I said, the way I've managed everything specific that has come up in this family for the past 4 years. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table. Then he looked back at me. He said, your job. The work you do for Kessler. That's a professional context where you have training and tools and a supervisor who can catch a mistake. Personal finances are different. Emotional decisions come into it. When you're lonely in a new place, when something breaks that you didn't budget for, when you just want to feel less like you're doing everything alone, those things cost money in ways that don't show up on a cash flow projection. I said, I've accounted for discretionary variance. He said, have you accounted for the fact that you've never felt what it's like to be actually alone? The room was quiet. My mother looked up from her plate. Her eyes went to my father and then to me and then back to her plate. I said, I'll learn. He said, you'll learn faster with a net. I said, your net has 2 signatures on it. He said, mine and yours. Both of us have to agree. That means you can always say no. I said, but you can also say no. To my own money. He said, in a scenario where I thought you were making a decision that would hurt you. Yes. I said, that's the restriction I'm describing. He said, that's a father who loves his daughter not wanting to watch her make an expensive mistake. He said love plainly. He said it the way he said the other practical things. It was true. I knew it was true. And it was being used, and both things were real at the same time, and that was the part one had no clean language for. My throat went tight. I didn't let it show. I said, I want to ask you something. He said, go ahead. I said, when I reconstructed your business records 4 years ago, 11 evenings, and you filed on time and got the $3,200 refund, did you think of that as me managing things alone or as me being competent? He said both. I said, when I wrote the dispute letter that got Eric his full deposit back, $1,650, did you think that demonstrated judgment? He said, it demonstrated that you knew how to write a letter. I said, it demonstrated that I read the statute, identified the applicable provision, and constructed an argument that held. That's judgment. He said, in that situation. Yes. I said, my situation in 6 days is less complex than that. He said, your situation in 6 days is one you've never been in. Eric's deposit dispute was something you watched from the outside. Your Clearwater Street apartment is something you'll be inside alone, and the stakes are not a single month's deposit. They're your financial foundation. He said it patiently. I'm not questioning your intelligence. I'm questioning your experience. Those are different things. I said, I have experience. He said, you have competence. Experience is what you get after the thing has gone wrong once and you've found your way through it. You haven't had that yet. I said, because I've managed carefully enough that things haven't gone wrong. He said, so far. I said, so far as 4 years. He said, 4 years with a safety margin you haven't had to test. He looked at the form. He looked at me. Sign the form, Salvii. Let us be the safety margin. That's what parents are for. Eric said, it's really not a big deal, Sol. It's a piece of paper. Dad's not trying to control anything. I looked at Eric. He said, you're making this into something it isn't. Dad just wants to know you're covered. I said, I am covered. He said, then what's the problem with the form? I said, the form gives Dad access to my savings. Eric said, which he already has. I said nothing. That was the center of it. Eric had said it without meaning to say it. He had said it because it was the working assumption of this table, had been for years, and he saw no reason to lower his voice around it. My father said, Eric. Eric looked at him. My father said, what I have is a secondary holder status on an account Salvii opened as a minor. I've never used it. I've never needed to. And I'm asking now formally to restructure that into something that works for both of us as adults. I said, the secondary holder status is what you're asking me to formalize. He said, I'm asking you to move it into a joint account structure with mutual consent requirements. I said, which is more access, not less. He said, it's more transparent. Right now I'm a secondary holder with no formal mutual consent requirement. This form adds that requirement. It actually protects you more than the current arrangement. He said it without blinking. He said it with the steady, patient confidence of a man who had thought through every angle of this before he printed the form, and that was the most frightening part. Not the anger. There was no anger. Just the preparation. My mother said very quietly, Gunnar. He looked at her. She said nothing else. She looked at her plate. He looked back at me. I said, what happens if I don't sign? He said, nothing happens. It's your choice. I can't make you sign anything. I said, but. He said, there's no but. I said, you said earlier that without the structure in place, you wouldn't be in a position to help me quickly if something went wrong. He said, I said the help couldn't move as fast without the structure. That's logistics. I said, you said you wouldn't be in a position to help me. He said, I said I'd be limited in what I could do quickly. I said, I'm asking you to say clearly what that means. He said, it means that family resources move efficiently inside family structures. That's all I'm saying. Aunt Petra said, Gunnar. She said it once. She said it in a tone I had never heard from her, low and even the tone of someone calling a name to stop a thing before it goes further. My father looked at her. She looked back at him without moving. He said, I'm having a conversation with my daughter. She said, I know what you're having. The table was very still. My father looked at me. His expression had not changed. It was still the settled expression, the one that had been in place since I walked in at 6:19 p.m. But something behind it had shifted slightly, the way a structure shifts when unexpected weight is applied from a direction it hadn't accounted for. He said, Salvi, I love you. I want you to be okay out there. That's the beginning and end of this. I said, I know. He said, then sign the form. I said, I need some water. I got up. I went to the kitchen. I stood at the sink and ran the cold tap and filled a glass and drank half of it without tasting it. Through the window above the sink, the yard was dark and wet. The fir trees were shapes against the darker sky. The neighbor's dock light made its pale smear on the standing water in the low part of the yard. The ferry horn sounded once, somewhere past the point, muffled by the rain and the distance. I set the glass down. I stood there. I thought about Marcus at the credit union and the date stamp and the processing batch that had run 3 weeks early. I thought about the $4,800 in the Bellport account, which had never appeared on any form my father had ever seen. I thought about the confirmation letter sitting in my bag by the door, folded in thirds the way things come when they've traveled. I had not planned to need it tonight. I went to my bag. I reached into the front pocket. The paper was there, folded exactly as it had been since the mail came 4 days ago. Letter-sized. The credit union's return address in the upper left corner. My name in the window, Salvi I. Larson, the middle initial they always included even though I never used it anywhere else. I held it for a moment. Then I walked back to the table. I sat down. I set the folded paper on the table in front of me, face down, parallel to the table edge. I did not open it. I looked at my father. He looked at the paper. He said, what is that? I said, something I need to show you. I put both hands flat on the table, one on each side of the paper. I looked at my mother. She was watching me. Her face had gone very still, the particular stillness of someone who can feel the temperature of a room changing and does not yet know what it's changing into. I looked at Aunt Petra. She had her hands folded on the table and she was looking at me with something in her face that was not quite recognition and not quite relief but was somewhere in the space between them. I looked at Eric. He was frowning slightly, looking at the paper, trying to read it through the fold. I looked at my father. He said, Salvi. I said, I know. Part 3. I reached for the paper. I slid it across the table toward him. I opened it. The paper unfolded in 3 panels, the way things come when they've traveled through the mail. The credit union's letterhead was at the top. Clean, plain, the kind of document that doesn't need to announce itself because what it contains is already done. My father looked at it. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. The letterhead said Harrow Point Community Credit Union. Below that, in the standard block format the credit union used for all formal correspondence, was a confirmation of account modification. Secondary account holder removal. Processed and complete as of Thursday at 2 p.m. Account holder of record, Solvi I. Ingrid Larsson. Secondary holder removed, Gunnar T. Larsson. He read it once. Then he read it again. I watched his face. His jaw tightened. Just once, just slightly, and then it released and he was composed again, and that composure was the thing I had been watching my whole life, that particular recovery, the way he moved through a surprise and came out the other side still holding the same expression he'd walked in with. He set the paper down. He said, "When did you do this?" I said, 6 weeks ago. He said, 6 weeks. I said, yes. He looked at the paper again. He looked at my name at the top of it. He looked at his own name below in the line marked removed. He said, "You did this 6 weeks ago and you didn't tell us." I said, "No." He said, "You've been sitting in this house at this table for 6 weeks, knowing this was in process and you said nothing." I said, "That's right." He said, "While we were planning this dinner. While your mother was making arrangements. While I was preparing that form." He said it evenly. "You knew." I said, "Yes." He said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I said, "Because I didn't need to." He said, "You didn't need to." I said, "It's my account. The removal was my right to make. I didn't need your permission and I didn't need to inform you in advance." He said, "I'm not talking about permission. I'm talking about the fact that you sat across from me at this table and let me go through this whole conversation." I said, "You went through the conversation because you wanted to. I didn't stop you." He said, "You let me present a form for an account you'd already closed to me." I said, "I let you finish." The room was very quiet. My mother had both hands in her lap now, pressed flat against her thighs. Her face had the stillness of someone who is trying very hard not to show what they are feeling, and is not entirely succeeding. Eric was looking at the letter. He was reading it from across the table, tilting his head slightly to make out the text. Aunt Petra was looking at me. Her hands were still folded. Her expression had not changed since she'd said my father's name. My father said, "I've been a secondary holder on that account since you were 17. I said, "You were added because I was a minor and the credit union required an adult cosigner. That requirement ended when I turned 18. He said, "I never used that access." I said, "I know." He said, "In 9 years I never touched that account." I said, "I know that too." He said, "Then why?" I said, "Because you filled out a joint authorization form with your name already on it and brought it to dinner." He said, "I brought it because I was trying to help you." I said, "I know you were." He said, "Then why does the letter exist?" I said, "Because I made a decision about my own account before you made a decision about it for me. That's the order things should happen in." He said, "I wasn't going to do anything without your signature." I said, "The form you slid across this table had your name filled in already." He said, "Your signature was still required." I said, "But you assumed it would come." He said, "I assumed we could have a conversation." I said, "We're having one." He said, "After the fact." I said, "Yes." He said, "You made this decision without telling us, without discussing it, without giving us any chance to." I said, "To what?" He stopped. I said, "To what, Dad? What would the chance have looked like? Would it have looked like tonight? A form already filled in. A dinner already arranged. A brother already briefed on which side he's on." Eric said, "I wasn't briefed on anything." I looked at Eric. He said, "I just think Dad has a point. You could have said something. If you were going to do this, you could have talked to us first." I said, "I didn't need to talk to you first. It's my account." He said, "It's a family thing." I said, "My savings account is not a family thing." He said, "Dad's been on it for 9 years." I said, "Because I was a minor and had no choice. Not because it was a family account." Eric looked at the table. My father said, "I want you to hear me." I said, "I'm listening." He said, "I have never done anything to your money. Not once. In 9 years. I said, "I know." He said, "And this is how you," he stopped. He looked at the letter again. He looked at the joint authorization form still sitting beside it, the one he had slid across the table 40 minutes ago, the one with his name at the top and the empty signature line below. He looked at both of them side by side. He said, "You planned this." I said, "I made a decision 6 weeks ago and I carried it through." He said, "You came here tonight knowing that form was pointless." I said, I came here tonight because you asked me to dinner. He said, did you know what I was going to ask? I said, I had a reasonable guess. He said, based on what? I said, based on the fact that my mother told me on a Sunday call 3 weeks ago that you've been asking her questions about my account balance and my plans for the move. My mother made a small sound. Not quite a word. I said, I'm not upset about that, Mom. I understand. She said, I didn't think. I said, I know. My father said, so you had 3 weeks to say something. 3 weeks to call me and say, Dad, I know what you're thinking, I've already handled it. I said, I could have done that. He said, why didn't you? I said, because I wanted to see the form. He said, you wanted to see it. I said, I needed to know what you were actually planning. Not what I guessed. What you actually brought to the table. He said, and now you know. I said, now I know. He sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at me. His expression had shifted into something I didn't have a clean name for. It was not anger, not quite. It was the expression of a man recalculating, running the new numbers through the same framework he always used and finding that they produce an outcome he hadn't prepared for. He said, I'm your father. I said, yes. He said, I've provided for you your whole life. I said, you have. He said, and I'm asking you, I'm telling you, that what I did tonight came from love. From wanting to make sure you were okay. I said, I know. He said, then why does this feel like a punishment? I said, it's not a punishment. It's a boundary. He said, you're punishing me for caring. I said, I'm showing you that the account is mine. That's not punishment. That's information. He said, information you've been sitting on for 6 weeks. I said, information that became relevant tonight. He said, I've stopped expecting much from her. He said it quietly. He said his own words back, not to me, not to the table. He said them the way you say something that has just changed weight. I said, you did. He said, I said it to you. Earlier. Before dinner. I said, I know. He said, and you want to tell me now that you've proven me wrong. I said, I don't need to prove anything. The letter exists. The account is mine. Those are facts whether you update your expectations or not. He was quiet for a long time. My mother said very softly, Gunnar. He didn't look at her. She said, she's right. He said, Ragna. She said, she's right that it's her account. It was always her account. We were on it because she was 17 and the rule required it, and she's 26 now and she did what she was entitled to do. She said it without raising her voice. She said it to the tablecloth. That's what happened. My father said, I understand what happened. My mother said, then I don't know what we're still discussing. The table was quiet. The rain had softened outside. Not stopped, just softened, the way PNW rain does when it's settling in for the night rather than making a point. The casserole dish sat cold in the middle of the table. The joint authorization form sat beside the credit union letter, his name at the top of one, his name at the bottom of the other, removed. Aunt Petra said, I think Salvii has been very clear. My father looked at her. She said, she's told you what the account is. She's told you what she did and when she did it. She's answered every question you've asked. She said it in the same low, even tone she'd used when she said his name earlier. I don't think there's more to add. My father said, I wasn't asking for your read on it, Petra. She said, I know. I'm giving it anyway. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at me. He said, you understand that this changes things. I said, what things? He said, between us. The way we do things. If you've decided that family structure is something you don't want, then I need to know that. I said, I didn't say anything about family structure. He said, you went behind our backs and removed me from an account without a conversation. I said, I made a legal change to my own financial account. That's not behind your back. That's my right. He said, without telling us. I said, without asking permission. Those are different. He said, I never asked you to ask permission. I said, you filled out a joint authorization form and brought it to dinner before asking if I wanted one. He said, I was trying to have a conversation. I said, I know what you were trying to do. He said, and what was that? I said, you were trying to make sure that when I walked out of this house in 6 days, you still had a hand on the lever. He said, "That's not fair." I said, "You told me tonight that family resources move efficiently inside family structures. You said that if I didn't sign, you wouldn't be in a position to help me quickly. You said that was logistics." I kept my voice even. "That's a condition. You set a condition on your help based on my access to my savings. That's what happened at this table tonight." He said, "I was talking about practical realities." I said, "I know. And the practical reality is that the account is already closed to you. Has been for 3 weeks. So the condition no longer applies either way." He said nothing. I said, "I'm not angry. I want you to know that. I'm not sitting here wanting you to feel bad. I came to this dinner because you asked me and because you're my family and I love you." I said it plainly. "But I saved that money one paycheck at a time for 4 years and it is mine and the decision about who has access to it is mine and I made it." He said, "You've stopped expecting much from us." I said, "I've stopped expecting that my savings account is a family decision." "Yes." He said, "That's not what I meant and you know it." I said, "It's what you said." He looked at the letter. He looked at the form. He looked at me. He said, "What do you want from this conversation?" I said, "I want you to understand that I won't survive out there because I've already been surviving. I've been surviving in this house quietly for 4 years, doing work that kept things running for this family while also saving $23,400 and finding a 1-bedroom apartment in Bellport and getting approved for a lease and arranging my own move. That happened. It happened without the structure you're describing. And I'd like that to be a fact you hold on to, because I won't be correcting the record again after tonight." The room was very quiet. He looked at me for a long time. He said, "You've clearly thought about this." I said, "I've had 6 weeks." He said, "And before that? Long before that?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I didn't know you were unhappy." I said, "I wasn't unhappy. I was clear. Those are different things too." He picked up the joint authorization form. He looked at his own name at the top. He set it back down. He did not fold it. He left it flat on the table beside the credit union letter and he looked at both of them together for a moment and then he looked away. He said, "Drive safe tonight." I said, "I will." He said, "The harbor road is bad when it rains." I said, "I know the road." He looked at me once more. His face was not settled anymore. It was something else. Something that had been reorganizing itself quietly for the past hour and had not finished yet. He said, "Call when you're in." I said, "All right." My mother stood up. She began clearing plates the way she did when a dinner was over, efficiently and without comment. She took the casserole dish. She took her own plate and my father's. She went to the kitchen and I heard the sink run. Eric picked up his phone. He looked at it without turning the screen on. He set it down again. Aunt Petra looked at me across the table. She gave me a small nod. I nodded back. I picked up the credit union letter. I folded it along its existing creases. I put it in my bag. I left the joint authorization form on the table. I got up. I put on my coat. I picked up my bag and my keys. I said goodnight to Eric. He said night quietly and did not look up. I went to the kitchen doorway. My mother was at the sink with her back to me. I said, "Thank you for dinner." She said without turning around, "Text me when you have the keys." I said, "I will." She said, "The lease signing." I said, "Yes." She turned then. She looked at me. Her face was tired and careful and something else underneath that I didn't have a clean name for. She said, "I'm proud of you." I should have said that more. I said, "It's all right." She said, "It isn't." "But thank you for not." She stopped. I said, "Mom." She said, "Thank you for coming tonight." I said, "Of course." I went out through the front door. The porch light came on automatically. The rain had dropped to a fine mist. The yard was dark and the standing water in the low part caught the porch light and held it. I walked to my car. I sat in the driveway for a moment before I started the engine. The house behind me was lit in the windows the way houses are when you've just left them, warm and contained and already slightly distant. I had grown up in that light. I had learned to read that light, to know from it whether the evening had gone well or whether there would be more conversation when I came downstairs in the morning. I would not be reading it much longer. 6 days. I reached into my coat pocket. There was a key there. Small brass worn smooth at the bow from years of being handled. It had belonged to my grandfather Olav Larsson, who had kept a flat-bottomed aluminum skiff in a slip at the Harrow Point Marina for the last 12 years of his life. He used it for early morning crabbing in the calm water behind the breakwater, just him and the cold and the ferry lane markers and the particular quiet of a harbor before the working day started. He had given me the key the summer I was 14, the summer he taught me to read a tide chart and to watch the sky for the kind of cloud formation that meant you had about 40 minutes before the wind changed. He had pressed the key into my hand and said, "So you always have somewhere to go that's yours." The skiff had been sold after he died. The key didn't open anything anymore. I had carried it in my coat pocket since I was 14 anyway. In every coat year-round. I moved it from the old one to the new one the way you move things that matter, without ceremony, just making sure it came with you. I held it now in the driveway with the engine off and the mist coming down on the windshield in the patient way it had of covering everything it touched. My grandfather had understood something about the distance between a family's idea of you and the actual shape of your life. He had built his own life quietly, in small boats in early morning harbors, and he had not required a room full of people to confirm that it was real. He had given me a key to a skiff and called it a place that was mine, and I had spent 12 years understanding that he meant something larger than a boat. It wasn't a place. It was the knowledge that you could leave. That the leaving was available. That even if you never used it, you held it, and holding it was the thing that let you stay on your own terms rather than someone else's. I had been staying on my own terms for 4 years. Building quietly. Saving carefully. Doing the work that kept this family's pieces in place while also, in parallel, building the parallel life that was 6 days from becoming the only one. I put the key back in my pocket. I started the car. The driveway gravel was soft from the rain and I backed out slowly onto the harbor road. The headlights swept across the fir trees at the edge of the property, their trunks dark and wet, their branches holding the mist in small, still pockets of light. I drove south. The harbor road was narrow and curved and I knew every turn of it. The sound was visible through the gaps in the trees, black and flat and carrying the lights from the ferry route markers in long broken lines across the water. The ferry horn sounded once past the point, the same low, carrying note I had been hearing from this road my entire life. The sound that said something large was moving steadily through the dark toward where it was supposed to be. I thought about the form sitting on the table. His name at the top. The signature line empty. I had not signed it. I had not needed to tell him I wasn't going to. I had simply opened a piece of paper and the paper had said everything. I thought about what my mother had said at the kitchen doorway. I should have said that more. She had said it without looking at me first, which was the way she said the things that cost her something. She had turned around and said it and then stopped herself before whatever came next, and I had said it's all right and she had said it isn't, and that was the most honest exchange we'd had in several years. I should have said that more. She had not said it easily. It had cost her something to turn around and say it, and I knew the cost and I held it carefully. I thought about Aunt Petra's nod across the table, once at the end, her hands still folded, her expression exactly as it had been when she arrived. One nod. She had been in that room the whole evening and she had said my father's name twice and she had given me one nod at the end, and that was enough. That was exactly enough. The Bellport exit came up on my right and I took it. The roads changed character here, wider and more lit, the kind of roads that belong to a working town rather than a harbor approach. I drove through the familiar grid of the freight district, past the Kessler offices dark behind their parking lot lights, past the corner store where I bought coffee on Monday mornings, past the intersection where Clearwater Street began. I drove it slowly. The building was mid-block, 3 stories, brick that had gone dark in the rain. The third-floor windows on the west side were dark. My windows. 6 days. I didn't stop. I drove past and turned south toward the sublet. I had a staff meeting at 8 a.m. I had a lease signing in 6 days. I had $23,400 in an account that was mine alone and $4,800 in a second account my father had never known about, and a job that was about to become something larger and a life that had been under construction for 4 years without anyone in that house fully seeing it. I thought about Annika Strand asking me if everything was all right as I left the office that afternoon. She had noticed I was leaving early. She had said to drive safe and meant it. She was the person who had hired me out of 40 applications and then promoted me when the role opened, and she had done both of those things based on work she had actually observed rather than a story someone had told her about me. That was not a small thing. I had been in enough rooms where the story preceded the work to know the difference. I thought about my grandfather's key in my pocket. He had pressed it into my hand on a summer morning on the dock at the Harrow Point Marina, the tide going out, the water in the slip green and cold and smelling of salt and diesel and the particular clean smell of low tide in a working harbor. He had said, "So you always have somewhere to go that's yours." He had been a quiet man and he had not said things he didn't mean, and he had said that one carefully, as though he had been thinking about when to say it and had decided on that morning on that dock and had not second-guessed the decision. I had not always known what he meant. I had thought at 14 that he was talking about the boat. At 17 I had thought he was talking about the harbor, about the particular quality of early mornings on the water before the day organized itself. At 20 I had begun to understand that he was talking about something he had built himself over many years, some arrangement with his own life that gave him a stable place to stand from which everything else looked manageable. He had not had the easiest family either. He had learned the same thing I was learning, by different means, in different weather, and he had given me the key because he wanted me to have the principle before I had the words for it. I had both now. The key was in my pocket. The road was wet and straight and I knew where it went. If any part of this story stayed with you, the quiet work, the long preparation, the moment you finally show someone what you've already done, I'd be glad if you passed it on to someone who might need to hear it.